Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Ismail Jalil from Washington, D.C. We seldom speak English, I think you have noticed. Most of the time we broadcast in Azerbaijani and in Russian to the region, but sometimes we have guests to whom neither language is accessible, so today we speak English. Thank you very much for your time in advance. We're going to speak to Andrea Prasow. She is the Executive Director of Freedom Now, and she's joining us from somewhere in the world. Andrea, I forgot to ask you where you are, if that's not an issue. So I can basically reach out and find you. Sorry, you're in Maryland, you said. Andrea, welcome to our show, and I'm very touched. I'm very pleased that you have found time for us. It probably shows the interest to the international human rights situation and the situation pertaining to Azerbaijan in particular. COP has just finished, the international gathering of the environmental advocates in Azerbaijan. Many people have accused Azerbaijan of greenwashing the public image that Azerbaijan has, the international image. We have 300, upwards of 300 political prisoners now, some of whom are my personal friends and some of whom are my dear colleagues, journalists. I'm wondering, did it work? From what you see and from where you look, did greenwashing the image of Azerbaijan through this international event, did it really work?
That's a great question, and thank you so much for having me. And I do want to apologize to your listeners for doing this in English. I wish I could communicate in other languages that would make it easier for more people to understand, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this. So did greenwashing work at COP? I think no, but no, it didn't work because I think organizations like mine and the really hundreds of other civil society organizations that worked very hard to make it very clear to the global community that Azerbaijan is a human rights disaster. I think that was a success, and yet no one was let out of prison. People were rounded up, as we know, in the months leading up to COP. And on the environmental side, there was no real progress, and the negotiations were really a bit of a disaster. So I don't think the greenwashing was a success, but Aliyev had a prominent global event take place in Baku, conducted negotiations, hosted world leaders. Many didn't attend, though none of them said publicly they weren't attending on human rights grounds. So I think the idea that he was able to present himself as an appropriate host, that was successful. And in our view, he never should have been chosen as a host. Azerbaijan was an unacceptable host for a negotiation that requires civil society participation.
We're talking about President Ilham Aliyev of Azerbaijan. We're referring to him, who has ruled Azerbaijan for about 2 decades now. I mean, who's counting? Andrea, I'm wondering, what signal does it send to you, to your organization, to you as a human rights lawyer, to your organization, to the international human rights community that prior, in the run-up to the conference and immediately afterwards, no political prisoners were released, and it doesn't seem that the strategy of the Azerbaijani government, in other words, its approach to people who are asking for, not even demanding, but asking for their rights, people who are bringing that up in public domain are being arrested. What signal does it send? What should we make of this, do you think?
Well, I think it's very concerning, and we were concerned from the first moment that Azerbaijan was selected as the host of COP29. This is the third authoritarian government in a row to host COP, the second petrostate in a row to host COP. When we look at the UAE from the year before and Egypt before that, both those countries have significant problems with political prisoners, denial of human rights, arresting anyone who opposes the government. So we really saw this as a trend. And what we also saw as a trend, in fact, I would say with this COP, we saw even fewer people speak out in support of human rights, in support of the civil society activists who were in detention than we had seen in previous COPs. Now, we can argue about scale. Egypt, for example, COP27, there are roughly 60,000 political prisoners. Azerbaijan has roughly 300, but the scale shouldn't matter. First of all, every political prisoner deserves to have their case raised in public, deserves to have ultimately their release, but to have world leaders demand their release and their fair treatment. But beyond that, the scale shouldn't matter. What should matter is when the UNFCCC, which is the UN body that decides where to hold these climate conferences, when it selects a host, it should look at the human rights situation. It should look at whether there was truly a free civil society. It should look at whether people who create environmental organizations are in detention, if people who speak out against government kleptocracy related to the oil and gas industry are in detention. Those should be considerations. And the world should use some of its diplomatic heft in advance of a global event like this to really press the country to comply with international law. And we didn't see that in this case.
How does it really work? You say the world should press. How is it done? Because most of the time, from what I understand, from where I'm looking, this is done in private negotiations and behind closed doors. This is done by various world governments, mostly governments of the West. How do you think this is done, and do you think this is working the way it's done?
Well, I'm not a climate activist myself. I'm a human rights lawyer and a human rights activist, so I can't speak to all the details about the climate negotiations. But I do know that the UN itself requires robust civil society participation. And in fact, the COP is created to allow for that kind of participation, which is supposed to give civil society activists their own space to raise the most relevant issues, which in Azerbaijan include political prisoners. But beyond that, when world leaders travel to events like these, they often do make public statements, and they often do so in advance, both publicly and privately. So months ago, some of the countries who attended COP29 could have been pushing Aliyev to say, you need to release political prisoners. If you don't, the story of COP29 will be your political prisoners, not what kind of host you were. And we don't have any evidence to see that they did that. Now, I'm not saying no one has done anything. And the EU had a number of statements, and of course there has been some pressure. But my impression is that many countries felt that 300 political prisoners, how do you compare that to, say, Belarus? How do you compare that to the crisis in Ukraine? Let's hold some of our diplomatic fire and save it for other areas. And that's just a really a huge disappointment.
There are two views. One is direct political pressure, and the other one is socialization, socializing countries into more or less acceptable, by the Western standards, by our standards, behavior. Which one do you think is a better, so carrot or a stick, which one is a better approach, do you think, strictly speaking, from the point of view of international human rights?
So I have the benefit of not having to be a government negotiator in any of these events. So I can certainly, I recognize that I'm not in those rooms, but there is room for everything, and every life matters. So if someone is a representative of a government, take, for example, the US government, though I've been extremely disappointed with US foreign policy when it comes to human rights, both President Biden and Secretary Blinken said that they would put human rights at the forefront of their foreign policy. So, for example, the US government's engagement with Azerbaijan should have included demand for release of prisoners publicly and privately throughout the months leading up to COP. And the same goes for many other countries, of course. Human rights, more pro-human rights government now in the UK, for example. And there are many countries that are not necessarily beacons of human rights, but still have a much more robust civil society than in Azerbaijan, where what we've seen in the last really 10 years, but most recently this latest wave is a complete abhorrence for any dissent.
Speaking of countries like Azerbaijan, what do you think makes Azerbaijan stand out? Is it the transactional approach? In other words, Azerbaijan strictly setting its own limits, its own red lines, saying we will negotiate with you on oil, let's say on gas, what have you, but we will not tolerate you lecturing us about human rights. What do you think stands out about Azerbaijan in this case? If we were to compare, I know we're comparing apples to oranges, you kind of hinted at that, but is it possible to sort of look at Azerbaijan's behavior in this particular regard, in regards to human rights, and other countries? What do you think stands out there?
Well, part of what is somewhat unique is the oil and gas. I mean, Azerbaijan has tremendous natural resources that others want. And, Aliyev was not wrong when he said in his opening statement at COP, the EU came to me. I didn't go to them to sell them more. They came to me, right? So we have to be realistic about that. For some time, there's been this sort of state-to-state concern that if the West was too hard on Aliyev, too hard on the Aliyev regime, that Azerbaijan would pivot towards Russia. I think that's happened a long time ago, and there isn't something that, whatever Western engagement might entail, that would change that. So I don't think that's a realistic concern, but I do think that plays into the way that some governments think about engagement with Azerbaijan. But like I said, they're sitting on natural resources that the reality is the reason we need things like COPs is the government, the world is too reliant on oil and gas. Azerbaijan has a resource that others want.
Many people who come and comment on this program would agree with you that Azerbaijan has pivoted towards Russia. It's just sometimes a message is missed. I would like to show a brief clip. Actually, let me just read what it is about. This is a website of the BBC. The headline is COP29 Chief Exec Film Promoting Fossil Fuel Deals. We're talking about Elnur Sultanov here. A secret recording shows the chief executive of Azerbaijan's COP29 team discussing investment opportunities in the state oil and gas company with a man posing as a potential investor. I'm just curious. There was a lot made out of this report. Is it at all appropriate to discuss fossil fuel deals at an event ostensibly dedicated to climate change? I will be the devil's advocate here. I will say, a lot of heads of state, heads of transnational oil companies or fossil fuel companies are there. Is it so bad to discuss these kinds of issues using the venue, or is it completely inappropriate? Forgive my ignorance, because I've never been to any such event.
I think you used the right word here, ostensibly about climate change. And I think that's what the world's starting to see, again, with 3 autocrats hosting in a row, 2 petrostates hosting in a row. Is this conference actually about doing something about climate change, or is it just an opportunity for governments to say that they care, to give ideally some space to civil society to raise their objections, but then to conclude deals? And I think, again, I'm not an environmental activist myself. That's not my area of expertise. That report was conducted by Global Witness. It was really phenomenal. Is it illegal for that conversation to have taken place, that deal? No. Is it deeply problematic? And does it highlight the fact that Azerbaijan should not host a conference that is intended to tackle climate change? Yes, of course.
Of course, I'll be very biased here because I'm a journalist, but in my personal belief, there's a special place in hell for people who jail journalists. I'm not saying that journalists are better or worse than any other people who raise human rights concerns, but we journalists have the inherent capability and duty to inform the public so the public would make informed decisions. What do you make of the fact that it is journalists who often find themselves the target of government oppression? And being a journalist in Azerbaijan, I know that we all practice self-censorship. When you go on the air, when you speak publicly, you have this voice in your head that says, if you cross that line, you're done. You'll be jailed. Still, given all that, given the fact that my colleagues, many of whom I know personally, and some of them are my friends, they're still ending up being in jail. What do you think of the fact? What kind of message does it send? I want to say chilling message, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. But am I right, or maybe I'm wrong in distinguishing journalists into a completely separate group?
Well, I don't think they're entirely separate, but I do agree with your assessment. Listen, political detention is not just about that person, the person who is in detention. It's a form of state-sponsored terrorism. It is designed to terrorize that individual's family, their community, and sometimes the general population or their class. Is it journalists? Is it activists? Whatever group they may belong to. That sort of action is designed to terrorize them. So Azerbaijan has in detention roughly 300 political prisoners, but there are tens of thousands of people who are terrified of being in the same position. So it's a very effective way of the state to terrorize its own population and to control them. And additionally, when it comes to journalists, they, as you say, are ideally truth tellers, can expose what's happening, not just to people in Azerbaijan, but to the rest of the world. And so I think the government believes they do pose a certain degree of an existential threat.
When you look at Azerbaijan, do you think the government, namely the President Ilham Aliyev, do you think he is more, I don't want to say afraid, but conscious of the criticism that is directed inward or outward? In other words, what is more potent, when journalists speak the truth to the Azerbaijani public, or when the word gets out to international mass media, to the human rights community, political domain, etc., etc.?
Well, I don't, I don't want to put myself in his shoes since I don't know enough about him personally and what motivates him. I will say we've seen crackdowns on both, right? There are people in detention who were telling their story inside Azerbaijan as well as outside. It's remarkable to me that you and I can even have this conversation, that this amount of journalism is acceptable, or at least so far. And I obviously very much hope that it remains that way.
Well,
But I think
I'm in
that
Washington, D.C. I'm sorry, I'm not there. I don't
of
think I
course,
could
of course.
do it from there.
But we also see attacks on people around the world by authoritarian states. We see what's called transnational repression. These governments don't just imprison people inside their borders, but they reach out to their families living abroad in order to continue that sort of terror. They can use electronic tools. For example, we know Azerbaijan is one of the few countries that has used Pegasus, a tool that is put on people's phones without their consent or their knowledge, and can track them. So it's really terrifying, I'm sure, to be a journalist or any kind of activist in Azerbaijan. And I think when you see journalists being detained wrongly by Azerbaijani authorities, by the Aliyev regime, it signals that there's some kind of fear, whether it's rational or not. Whether the journalist could actually expose something that the Aliyev regime does not want exposed, I don't think that matters. It's more about fear and control.
There is a Chinese proverb that I grew up hearing. I don't know if it's true or not, but my mother and my father have told me, when the Chinese want to curse somebody, they say, "May you live in the time of change." We are living in this time of change. In the West, we have the benefit of seeing governments change. Some people voted in, some people voted out. And with that comes change in foreign policy, in the approach to human rights, something that is very dear to my heart, and I'm not making any secret out of this. What do you think will change? From what you see, the incoming administration, the people that it appointed, the signals that it's been sending so far? Of course, we're in November, and President Trump is going to, enter the White House in January. It's probably still early to speculate, but this is exactly what we're doing. We're speculating, we're hoping, and we're trying to prejudge the foreign policy that Washington is going to have. What do you think the signals are? Are you disheartened? Are you optimistic? What do you feel will happen?
Well, if you take as the starting point that I was disappointed with the Biden administration's foreign policy for not being sufficiently pro-human rights, I think it's reasonable to assume that I am very disappointed about what I think we'll see from the Trump administration. I don't think it's speculation. I think it's predictions based on past experience. So don't forget, of course, Trump was president before in the US. So we do have a pretty good sense of ways that he may engage with the world. In general, I believe the Trump administration will be a complete disaster when it comes to human rights, both domestically and abroad. I think the US probably long ago lost its reputational standing around the world in terms of being a promoter of human rights. Not that it ever had a pure background, of course, anyway. But, up until even now, I would say that it matters, for example, to someone in unjust detention anywhere in the world, if their name is mentioned on the floor of the US Senate or the US Congress. It matters to them. Sometimes, we always say sometimes that alone keeps them alive. Sometimes guards won't beat someone as vigorously if they know that they're on the news. So for many years, the US has had some positive influence, at times also negative, on foreign policy. But the biggest concern that I have is that the Trump administration, well, Trump himself, it's entirely unpredictable. We can make predictions based on past experience on certain issues. For example, immigration. We know very clearly what path that administration will take on immigration in the US. Foreign policy, though, is up for grabs. It's not going to be human rights friendly, that's for sure. But I wouldn't put it past, for example, incoming President Trump, if he were to meet with Aliyev. Maybe he'll be his new favorite dictator, as he said in the past, but also could say, like, why is this guy in jail? Or why don't you let a few people out? The people will love you, something like that. So, we still have work to do, even with the Trump administration. Human rights advocates have a lot that we hope to be able to get from the administration, as well as damage we hope to mitigate. But I think it's very hard to predict what we will see when it comes to foreign policy, because Trump is a very engages on a personal level with foreign leaders in a way that we don't usually see in the U.S.
The best predictor of the future is the past, they say, or I say quite often. But, when it comes to the Trump administration, what we've seen in the past is, as you mentioned, the personal rapport he seems to establish with leaders who have autocratic tendencies. And I think we can safely count Ilham Aliyev among those. Do you think in negotiations with such people, there's enough people in the U.S. State Department, in the human rights community, non-governmental actors who whisper in the ear of the administrations in Washington, D.C., to sort of bring, in other words, what I'm trying to ask, do you think there is enough muster among the human rights community here in Washington and all over the United States, or maybe all over the world, to have the ear of the incoming administration when it comes to human rights, abuses, torture, freedom of the press, etc.?
I think I would say it's possible, but I don't anticipate it. You mentioned people at the State Department. One of what we expect to be a key feature of this administration under incoming President Trump is a vast curtailing of federal government powers. So we just don't know what that will look like. Will thousands of people be fired from the State Department? Probably not, but we don't know. We don't know what degrees of authority there will be. Now, Senator Marco Rubio has been nominated to be, or named that he will be nominated to be Secretary of State under President Trump. He is, arguably the most reasonable of the various cabinet picks that we've seen so far. And he has a pretty good track record dealing with political prisoners and a number of human rights issues. Now, of course, his boss will be President Trump, and he will have, his obligation will be to the president. But I think there's some real prospects there in terms of certain human rights issues coming to the fore, including that of political prisoners specifically. Under President Trump, the last time he was in power, he was actually quite successful at bringing American citizens home from detention abroad. And in some of those cases, some of the ways those cases were resolved resulted in the release of people who were being held by their own governments. So sometimes people are charged in the same case, for example, and the outcome is dismissal of the entire case rather than an individual being released. So anyone else charged with that case could be released. So that kind of work, there are some opportunities there to push with the Trump administration. But until it's in place and until we see what happens with personnel, really, it's very difficult to predict. Of course, we also are going to have a Republican Senate and a Republican House, and that makes it very difficult to push on issues because there will likely be alignment between Congress and the president. When you don't have that, which is quite common in the US, often there's the president from one party and the Senate and or the House from another party. A little bit of those checks and balances that are built into the US system are available to you. So the president is not a king, and so far is not an actual autocrat in the United States, does have democratic checks and balances. But if the Republican-led Congress toes the party line and does whatever the president wants, then it's more likely that he will be able to effectuate his policies quite quickly.
Let's take a look at the history now. The reason I'm asking this question, the following question, is I've observed quite a lot of Azerbaijanis, be it people from the political realm, be it people from the government, non-governmental organizations, everyday people who have this particular sort of view of the outcome, two possible outcomes of the U.S. elections. And it's very binary and it's very simplistic, and I'm going to simplify it. Democrats, bad. Republicans, good. And when making this choice, when distinguishing bad from good, they tend to think that Democrats usually have pay more attention to human rights. They criticize Azerbaijan more, and they tend to, at least try to impose sanctions. When it comes to Republicans, the thinking in Azerbaijan is we can deal with those guys. Is that the right way to approach it, or is it more nuanced? I mean, I want people in Azerbaijan watching you right now to hear it from you whether this is correct or incorrect and what the fallacies are of this approach.
Yeah, I don't think it's correct at all. I think if you were to poll members of both parties on sort of human rights issues, it may be that more Democrats than Republicans would identify certain human rights issues that they would say they care about. But on the issues that I work on, for example, that of political prisoners, those are really personal issues. I have never had a meeting with a member member of Congress, Republican or Democrat, who heard me talk about a political prisoner and said, "Oh yeah, that guy should be in jail." They don't think that. They think that regardless of what someone has done, they deserve a fair trial. They shouldn't be mistreated in detention. They should have access to a lawyer. They shouldn't be detained for political reasons. Are they willing to do something about it? That can vary. But some of these core human rights issues really speak to individual values, not political values. But we do live in a political and media oriented society. So often these issues take on a degree of publicity and politics that I don't think they should. I don't think political prisoners are about politics. They're about human rights and complying with the law.
The next question comes from our viewer, our regular. It's in English. What if Azerbaijan releases all of the imprisoned Azerbaijani citizens except for the Nagorno-Karabakh? Except for the Karabakh separate. I should wear my glasses. Except for Karabakh separatists, will that be satisfactory? I think we both understand the background of the question. I wanted to get into this topic, but let's start with the question, and then we'll talk more about this.
Sure. Well, I and my organization work on a number of specific cases, and we work on a number of specific issues. Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an incredibly important issue, is not one that I have personal expertise on. So I would say that any political prisoner should be released, or if they have actually committed a crime, they should be charged with an actual crime and prosecuted in a fair trial. That's my baseline position for anyone. And it's not about what conflict they were involved in or not involved, or the alleged purpose behind their detention. People who are being held purely for political reasons or to upset them, upset their families, terrorize the population, people who have not committed crimes should not be in detention. That's my baseline position, regardless of why they are being held by the government.
But do you think taking up arms to fight the central government, the internationally recognized government, or being the political leader of people who took up arms to fight the regular army is a human rights issue, or do you think that is a violation of the rule of law? I'm specifically referring to Ruben Vardanyan, who is represented internationally by the former president of Freedom Now, who I understand, Jared Yesner, who I understand is no longer associated with your organization. Is that correct?
That's right. He was one of our founders, and we're very grateful that we exist as Freedom Now and that we can represent political prisoners around the world. But he's no longer associated with us, so I can't really speak to his cases and his clients. Of course, if there is an armed conflict, we would go into a different legal analysis related to the laws of war and the international armed conflict, what laws apply, whether or not someone can be held in detention. Something I worked on myself for many, many years because I represented men held in Guantanamo. And related cases. So there is a complicated legal analysis. I can't do it right now, but I think you're raising valid questions, and those are questions that people should look at and care about. And if someone is being held unlawfully, then they should be released. If someone is being prosecuted in the wrong forum, but they should be prosecuted in a particular forum, so be it. For example, the men in Guantanamo who were being prosecuted in military courts, if they were to be prosecuted at all, should have been prosecuted in civilian courts.
I'm showing the website news.am. It's safe to presume it's based in Armenia. This is Mr. Gesner that I referred to earlier. He is in the headlines. He is billed as the international lawyer who represents Ruben Vardanyan. And I'm sorry, we're circling back to this issue. There's a lot of interest from the audience. This is a narrative that I'm voicing right now, and this is a narrative from some people in Azerbaijan, and frankly speaking, from our colleagues, yours and mine, from people who work in international human rights. They see a conflict of interest between someone being a lawyer for a separatist leader, as he's called in Azerbaijan, and heading an international organization. Of course, we're talking about the past, but perception is reality in this world. Optics matters. Do you think there was a legitimate concern for conflict of interest when it comes to an organization ABC fulfilling its duty as an international human rights supporter, and its head or president or someone closely associated with it representing the rights of a prisoner who headed an army basically fighting the government?
Jared Gensler is not associated with Freedom Now anymore and hasn't been for years. So I don't see any issue. Any prisoner should have access to their counsel And it is definitely a challenge in Azerbaijan, where I know there are very few lawyers because of this crackdown. Lawyers are terrified to represent political detainees. It's very difficult to find a lawyer. So the issue of whether someone should have access to their lawyer is very clear cut. You don't have to like their lawyer. There are lots of lawyers that I don't like, but people still have the right to counsel.
Mm. You know, Azerbaijanis have grown up, and this is another narrative. My generation has grown up seeing the perceived bias from the West, saying the West is on the side of, Armenia, the West is on the side of separatism. In some cases, it supports separatism, let's say in Azerbaijan, and in some cases, it is staunchly against it in Georgia, in Ukraine, elsewhere, in Moldova, for instance. Do you see this approach as duplicitous? Is this narrative easy to combat?
Well, when I mentioned before about the US having a complicated history of foreign policy, I think that's part of what I was referring to. Of course, there are some very positive things when I look at my own government that it has done in support of human rights. And there are many terrible, terrible things, some of which we probably still don't know about because the information is classified or well hidden. So I don't think it's news that governments interfere with other governments, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. I don't think it's news that they do so for their own political aims. We have the benefit of an international legal structure, international human rights, that sets out governments' obligations with respect to the people in their territory and with respect to their own citizens. And of course, countries also have their own domestic laws, and that's what I look to when the question is someone being detained lawfully or unlawfully? Are they being treated lawfully or unlawfully? So those are the sources that I look to for that.
Well, here's a concern and, frankly speaking, a lament that I'm hearing from my colleagues, from people I've trusted for decades in the issue of human rights. When they look at what work is being done, let's say, I can show you better than I can tell you. This is a Lantos Commission hearing on September 19th, at which you participated and spoke. I'll show the short clip of this. The title of it is Human Rights in Azerbaijan Since the Fall of Nagorno-Karabakh. And what drew my attention here is the list, and I'm truly hoping that the viewers can see this. Let me see if I can make it bigger or not. Well, this is a list of speakers, and there is not a single Azerbaijani represented in this list. We have Digam Stepanyan, human rights defender, Republic of Artsakh. Actually, that is the bigger part of the problem. Billing somebody as Republic of Artsakh, I know you have personally nothing to do with this, but Republic of Artsakh is an unrecognized entity. Many in Azerbaijan have taken exception to that. There is not a single Azerbaijani name on the list of the panelists who spoke there. The concern that I'm hearing is they are discussing us, our rights, our futures, without us present. That is, to some people, that is demeaning. To some people, that harkens back to the era where Westerners got together and talked about, smaller indigenous people and decided their fate. Do you think there is any truth to that argument? Do you think there is any validity to that narrative?
I think it's a very valid concern. That's why I didn't testify in my personal capacity. What I did is I read composite testimony from Azerbaijani human rights activists who were too afraid to testify in person or even have their names used because they feared retribution from the Aliyev regime. So my testimony, which is available on that website, and it's available on Freedom Now's website as well, it's their words. I read their words. When I answered questions, I made clear if I was answering elaborating a point they had made or answering in my capacity as executive director of Freedom Now. But I did so because I felt that they deserve to have their voices heard. I am not Azerbaijani. I cannot speak for Azerbaijanis, but I was able to read aloud their words at that moment. And I think that there's value to that. It's also very fair to have a disagreement about that.
And I'm very thankful to you personally because you brought up the names of people whom I consider my personal friends, and you read their testimony. You know what really jumped at me in that short 6 minutes, I believe, you spoke for 6 minutes. You mentioned people being tortured under the signs or directly in front of the signs that call for the end of torture. What is this? Is this a move to break the will of the people? Is this cynicism that is being demonstrated? Is this sort of like in your face kind of gesture? What do you think? What kind of signal do you think the government tries to send to its people and to the international community when that happens?
Well, we could have a long conversation about the psychology of prison guards and the dehumanization of prisoners. But I think what we see is in an autocracy and in other environments as well. But in an environment that says people are subhuman, people are not worthy of legal protection, the message is the gloves are off. Treat them as you wish. Whether there are directives to torture a particular person or not, there may be in some cases. I don't have information about that myself, but I think overall what we see is just a culture that says these people are not worthy, and then they're treated accordingly.
Mm. Also, in your testimony, what drew my attention is you mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh as a disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. I wonder who disputes it. You're Canadian and American. This is what I read about you. Both governments recognize Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. And we would talk about, words matter, especially words coming from the mouth of people who work on human rights. When we talk about Nagorno-Karabakh being disputed, who disputes it exactly?
Well, in this case, as you'll recall, I was reading the testimony of Azerbaijanis themselves who wrote that. So I was reading their words. I don't have a personal position on it. It's not my place to, other than to continue to stress for the recognition of human rights for everyone, regardless of where they are.
But Freedom Now does not dispute it. That's what I'm trying to get to.
It's not our position to dispute it or to recognize territory. That's just not something that we do.
Okay, that's fair. Going back to the narrative again, and these, I speak to a lot of people, and mostly the people that I speak to, and I'm hearing political news from people who work on human rights. So here's a lament, another lament, and another concern. We are seeing some people, some human rights defenders, some journalists, some activists being made into international stars. And I understand that. Again, optics matters. But the thing is, others feel abandoned and left behind and forgotten. If we were, you and I, or, if we bring together some 10 people working in international human rights, chances are 8 of them would name Gubadi Badoglu and Anar Mehmetli as, the faces of people who are currently in detention in Azerbaijan on human rights violations grounds. But there are many others, and I'm, again, thankful to you because you voiced all those names. You talked about Ulvi Hasanli, you talked about Sevinç Vakifkızı, you talked about my colleagues at Abzats and Toplum TV, which recently started broadcasting again in Azerbaijan. Andrea, is it true that there are some who are made into international megastars whose name is on every poster, in every report, in every testimony given before the U.S. Congress, etc., and the others, are they in tow? How does this work? What is the mechanics of this? Who gets to decide whose case is more attractive and who should be waiting in the coattails?
Well, this is the theory behind highlighting particular cases is that people engage with a personal story. They can feel connected to an individual story. Sometimes family members of an individual are there to tell the story, and then they start to care personally, and they want to see that person released. And that in doing so, their actions lead to the release of others. If you look back at an example in the US, I used to work for many years on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was engaged in a conflict in Yemen that caused the suffering of untold numbers of civilians. Very, very little attention in the US. It was difficult to get a meeting to talk about Saudi Arabia. And then Jamal Khashoggi was kidnapped, murdered, and dismembered in a horrific crime that I think we're all familiar with. And suddenly, members of Congress were very eager to condemn Saudi Arabia. They engaged with the story of him as an individual, one man, when they said almost nothing for years about the Yemeni civilian suffering. But that then let us press the government on its relationship with Saudi Arabia as a whole, which included its conduct of the war in Yemen. So it's a tool. It's very, I'm sure it's heartbreaking for the people who don't hear their name read. As you said, that's why I tried to read as many names as I could in my testimony. But it is a tool. And one of the things I have seen with many of the individuals who are involved in those cases that you say are most prominent is that when they talk about their family members, they also talk about the other political prisoners. They recognize that they have, a tremendous sense of responsibility to the others as well, and no one tells them they have to do that, but they do that of their own volition. The other thing that we've tried to do, Freedom Now is part of the Demand Rights at COP network. We hosted a virtual gathering called Not at COP on November 14th, a place for those of us who were not at COP, like myself, and like many Azerbaijanis in exile, as well as we were able to have someone who was at COP from Amnesty International call in and join. And more than half of our speakers were Azerbaijani at that event. We thought it was really, really important that if we're going to talk about human rights in Azerbaijan, we do so by hearing directly from people in Azerbaijan. Now, what we hear from Azerbaijanis in exile and those in the country too is that they want help from international organizations and from the West. It's not that they don't want our involvement. So, my job as a human rights activist sitting in Washington, D.C., is to elevate their voices as much as I can, to help tell their story, to put them in front of lawmakers, and to try to create that personal connection so that when it comes to making policy, if it's the US, if it's the EU, if it's Canada, people have those individual stories in the backs of their minds, and that can affect their policy towards the regime in general going forward.
We talked about Saudi Arabia, and may I say a couple of words on this topic? The first trip that then President Donald Trump made was not to London, not to Paris, but it was to Riyadh. On the coattails of the event with Jamal Khashoggi being cut into pieces in a consulate in Istanbul, this actually, it's also in itself a chilling imagery, isn't it? I mean, this sort of send a message as to what the approach is going to be, going back to our conversation about the past being predictor of the future. Are you at all concerned that these kinds of cases will escalate with President Trump in power, if we can revisit in the light of what you just said?
Absolutely. I think that my primary concern is domestically in the US, where I'm concerned that we will see a real trickle-down effect of a culture that devalues women, that devalues the democratic process. We had January 6th, as we refer to it by the date here in the US, of course. So I think there's a lot of trickle-down effect that people are concerned about in the US. But as we talked about before, President Trump is very mercurial. No one knows what he will do when it comes to his engagement in foreign policy. And governments tend to like to act in concert with others. They don't tend to like to act alone. So if he takes certain actions that are different from others, it may give other countries, they may feel they have more leeway to behave the way that he is as well. But, I haven't given up hope. I've been doing this for more than 20 years. There have been not so positive times. I always tell people in the US, for many people, human rights activists, they thought the Obama administration was a high point. That was devastating for me because I was representing men in Guantanamo. Under the Obama administration, President Obama, who was a constitutional lawyer, said the US can detain people indefinitely without charge or trial. I mean, that was shocking. That was a vast change to US practice, completely illegal and done by a Democratic president. So it's not that we haven't been through difficult times before. Human rights activism is not the most popular activity or career at times, but I'm fortunate to get to do what I do from where I sit in a safe, secure environment. And so we just try to reach out to those activists who aren't, the Azerbaijanis in exile, those who are in Azerbaijan who would be activists. We have a program in Afghanistan where we try to support Afghan women who were not activists. They just are living their lives under the Taliban and suddenly realize the only way to live is to become a human rights activist because the government has stripped you of all your rights. So that fight will continue wherever we are and whoever's in power in the US and Azerbaijan or elsewhere.
Invisible hat tip to you doing this for 20 plus years. This is enormous stress, and I understand it as someone who's been in the circles, not directly involved, but indirectly and very close to human rights for about 20 years. I can appreciate and I can understand the stress that comes with it, which is often undervalued. What does it do to a human? What does it do to a soul to care about human rights, to see a president who is a constitutional scholar talk about detentions and calling them legal, to see a journalist cut to pieces, to read reports about people being raped in prison for their political views? What does it do?
Well, I think it's very individual, but I'm still doing this, so I guess it motivates me. Um, I haven't given up. What is frustrating is that I think a lot of people have given up on the International Human Rights Project. One of the things we saw under the previous Trump administration was an attack on human rights organizations and an attack on the very notion of certain international human rights. In the US, there was something called the Commission on Unalienable Rights, and it was designed to acknowledge human rights, but make them sort of the tiniest little core of human rights, and anything else, which includes reproductive rights, LGBT rights. Those were sort of these extra rights that could be dealt with if people felt like it. But the core rights were the ones that the Trump administration was willing to get behind. But like I said, I'm still here, and I get to do this for a living. I get to do this from the safety of my own home. So the fact that I can do that, I get to go to work every day and try to support human rights defenders around the world. That's a tremendous privilege.
Again, invisible hat tip. Given your record and given the time that you've spent working on this issue, I would like to ask you, I would like to put it in a historic context for you. The people that I talk to, and again, these are not narratives coming from the government. The government of Azerbaijan will understand. They have a particular view, and their view is not going to coincide with yours. But I'm talking to my colleagues, my fellow Azerbaijanis who are in the world of human rights. The lament that I hear, some of it that I voiced, that international human rights community is perceived as anti-Azerbaijani and pro-Armenian. There is an inherent bias against Azerbaijanis, and human rights is being even used as a tool for international policy to attain political goals, and human rights is sort of a stick that you beat people with. These are some narratives. I'll let you answer any and all parts of the question if you would like. But another narrative that I'm hearing from the people, in addition to what we've already discussed, is often people who are representing Azerbaijan in particular. And I don't know, maybe that is a situation in other countries as well. But I have a tunnel vision. I focus on Azerbaijan primarily. So this is my perception at times as well. Azerbaijan is being represented at these international conferences by, I don't want to say random people. I'm sure they have their own regalia and they have their own recognition and they worked hard to attain some of it. But oftentimes the criticism is, okay, who are these people on the panel? Who do they speak on behalf of? They have not visited Azerbaijan in the last 20 years. They don't even come to the proximal countries to Azerbaijan. They don't really know what's happening in the country itself. Is that a legitimate concern? And again, I stress this concern comes from my colleagues, not from the government trolls and not from the government spokespeople. This comes from the people who try to work on human rights. And the problem that I see with it is, when you see people who are really selected randomly or under very strange circumstances, legitimate people are afraid to join that panel. They're worried that their name will be associated with so and so. People who are considered quite unpopular in Azerbaijan. And in the end, that makes our lives a little more difficult, our work, I'm referring to human rights defenders, a little bit difficult. This is the lament that I hear from human rights defenders in Azerbaijan. Please.
Well, I think it's very context specific, but I think you are describing a problem that is not unique to Azerbaijan, but that I see living and working in Washington, that you see in London, that you see in capital cities around the world, sort of a think tankitis where people become experts and they talk to other experts, so-called experts, and they spend a lot of time talking to each other about issues without talking to the people who have the lived experience. But what I've also seen, as we've said, I've been doing this for 20 plus years, is an evolution in the way that international human rights activists see their role. And that's what I think the way we do this well, and I'm really proud of how we do this at Freedom Now, is that we work closely with activists on the ground or in exile, depending on the circumstances, those most affected by the issues, to try to figure out what matters to them and how we can use what little, political access we have or media access we have to take forward their issues. So in last year, when Baku was selected as the site of COP29, what we did is we reached out to the Azerbaijani activists that we've been working with for years and said, there's going to be a big global event. The world's eyes will be watching. Should we engage? If so, what can we do? What matters? And the people we work with anyway said, raise the issue of political prisoners. Let's take advantage of this moment to raise the issue of political prisoners. And that has guided our work for the last 11 months. And that's the way I think that we do this well. But it is a challenge. There are big international human rights behemoths. There are commentators. The media wants to publish people who are already published, so it's difficult to get op-eds by people most affected by human rights abuses. And of course, in the case of Azerbaijan, you're operating in an environment with an autocrat who has suppressed most civil society engagement. So civil society is not at its strongest. It does need or would benefit from the support of others, but we just have to do that thoughtfully.
Andrea, my final question, I've taken too much of your time today, but my final question is, I really would like to ask an optimistic one to end on a high note and ask, about the view of the future, but I'm afraid we're not going to find much optimism there. I would like to ask you to address this narrative that I hear often, quite often, and it's working. And it's working because it's being repeated by the Russian propaganda machine, it's being repeated by the Azerbaijani media, it's being repeated even by the Turkish media from time to time, that democracy or human rights are an inherently alien concept that comes in direct contradiction with quote-unquote traditional values. We'll have to define those, and we don't have that much time. But what I often say to Azerbaijanis who repeat this narrative is, when in 1918 we gained our independence from the Russian Empire, we proclaimed the Azerbaijani Democratic Republic. In other words, our founding fathers had the vision to include democracy as a founding principle of the country. What is your response to the narrative that democracy is a purely Western idea and it doesn't work with traditional quote-unquote societies, given your international work and scope?
That's a common refrain, usually from autocrats or dictators who don't want to actually have to be accountable to the people that they're supposed to represent. It's not unique to Azerbaijan. It's something I've heard around the world. And I think it does a real disservice to the people of these countries who themselves are usually the ones demanding democracy. I mentioned Afghanistan earlier. I think that's a great example. The Taliban will say all sorts of things that most people don't agree are remotely accurate descriptions of Sharia, of Islamic law, and they'll say, democracy is not inherent to our culture. Well, tell that to all of the women and girls who are not allowed to go to work and can't go to school. They are the ones saying that thing that we got from, among other things, deeply flawed Western intervention, that opportunity to build a society for 20 years, a democratic society that still was flawed, still was developing. That was the thing that let us be who we want to be. And having those rights taken away, having your vote occur but not count, that really, I think it does a huge disservice to individuals who, if you ask them on an individual basis, do you believe that you should be able to marry who you want, go to school when you want to, have a kind of job that you want to have a fair trial? If you're arrested, should there be charges against you? Should you be able to speak to a lawyer? Should you be able to go before a judge? People say yes, they want that. They don't necessarily use the language of international human rights, and that's okay. They don't have to. But I think that leaders who want to continue to suppress any kind of true civic engagement in their populace, they're the ones who really promulgate that narrative.
Andrea, thank you very much for your time today.
It's been such a pleasure, Ismail. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Andrea Prasow, Executive Director of Freedom Now, joining us from Maryland, and I, Ismail Jalil, from Washington. Thank you very much for watching us today. Before the broadcast ends, please press like so that this broadcast gets to a larger number of people. We don't have enough English speakers watching us, unfortunately, and that's partly our fault because we seldom address our audience in English, but sometimes circumstances dictate. Thank you very much for your time, and have a good night.